World War II ended in August 1945. Nations surrendered, armies laid down their weapons, prisoners went home. History closed the chapter on the deadliest war mankind had ever fought. But on a small, forgotten island in the Philippines, a Japanese soldier cleaned his rifle and prepared for patrol. He had not heard the emperor's surrender broadcast. He did not believe the leaflets falling from the sky. And he did not accept that a war built on absolute loyalty could simply stop. For him, surrender was not a political decision. It was a direct violation of an order. Years passed. Then decades. The jungle aged around him. The world rebuilt without him. While humanity stepped into the modern era, one man remained frozen in 1945, still fighting, still obeying, still waiting for an order that never came. This is the true story of the last Japanese soldier who refused to surrender, and the war that followed him long after the world had moved on. Hiroo Onoda was born in 1922 in Wakayama Prefecture, at a time when Japan was still shaping itself into a modern empire. His childhood unfolded in a nation quietly preparing for endless war. Military parades were common. School textbooks glorified sacrifice. Children were taught that the emperor was divine, and that loyalty to him outweighed loyalty to family, life, or reason itself. Japan did not raise soldiers suddenly in wartime. It raised them from childhood. From an early age, Onoda learned discipline not as a tool but as a moral obligation. Obedience was not questioned. Orders were not debated. The purpose of the individual was to serve the state, and the highest form of service was endurance. Pain was not something to be avoided. It was something to be mastered. By the time Onoda reached military age, Japan was already deeply entrenched in war across Asia. The army did not simply train men to fight, it trained them to never stop fighting. Surrender was considered a betrayal of the emperor, the nation, and one's ancestors. Soldiers were told that capture brought shame not only upon themselves, but upon their families for generations. Death was preferable. Survival without honor was not survival at all. Unlike many young conscripts sent directly to the front, Onoda was selected for specialized training. He attended the Nakano School, a secretive military intelligence academy responsible for training Japan's best operatives in espionage, sabotage, and guerrilla warfare. This training was unusual. While most Japanese soldiers were taught to fight and die, Nakano cadets were taught something different. They were taught to survive at all costs. Onoda learned how to live off wild plants, how to move silently through jungle terrain, how to read human behavior, and how to wage war alone. He was trained to operate without supply lines, without communication, and without support. If isolated, he was to continue his mission indefinitely. But this emphasis on survival did not soften the Army's doctrine. Instead, it reinforced it. Survival was not for personal benefit, it was for the continuation of the mission. The war, Onoda was taught, was not defined by time. It was defined by orders. In December 1944, as Allied forces advanced relentlessly across the Pacific, Onoda received his assignment. He was summoned, briefed, and given instructions with the quiet seriousness that marked Japan's officer corps in the final months of the war. His destination was Lubang Island, a small, forest-covered island in the Philippines. Strategically insignificant on its own, Lubang sat along supply routes used by Allied forces. Onoda's task was to disrupt enemy operations, destroy infrastructure if possible, and most importantly, prevent the use of the island by the enemy. He was not sent to win a battle, he was sent to deny victory. Before his departure, Onoda met with his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. The conversation that followed would become the most important moment of Onoda's life. Taniguchi did not speak dramatically. He did not exaggerate the danger. He simply explained reality. Japan was losing territory. Communication could be cut. Reinforcements might never arrive. Onoda was to prepare for a long campaign, possibly lasting years. Then came the order that would define everything. You are forbidden to surrender. You are forbidden to take your own life. No matter how long it takes, we will come back for you. The wording mattered. Onoda was not told to die. He was told to endure. The responsibility for ending his mission did not belong to him. It belonged to the Imperial Army alone. Onoda accepted the order without hesitation. When he arrived on Lubang Island later that month, the situation was already deteriorating. Japanese forces were poorly supplied. Morale was collapsing. American aircraft dominated the skies. Many local commanders were focused on short-term survival rather than long-term resistance. Onoda immediately clashed with other officers on the island. He ordered the destruction of airfields and supplies to prevent enemy use, but local commanders refused, preferring to conserve resources. To Onoda, this hesitation was dangerous. The island would fall, and when it did, only those prepared for long-term resistance would survive. He was right. By February 1945, American forces had effectively taken control of Lubang Island. Organized Japanese resistance collapsed. Soldiers were killed, captured, or scattered. Communications with Tokyo vanished entirely. Onoda and a small group of men retreated into the island's dense interior, carrying rifles, ammunition, and the orders they had been given. They disappeared into the jungle as the rest of the war moved on without them. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. On Lubang Island, no one told Hiroo Onoda. In the months that followed, aircraft dropped leaflets announcing the end of the war. Loudspeakers broadcast messages urging soldiers to surrender. Newspapers appeared, explaining Japan's defeat. Onoda examined every message carefully and rejected them all. The idea that the empire had surrendered without a direct order was unthinkable. Psychological warfare, he believed, was a known enemy tactic. False information was expected. Deception was part of war. His training had prepared him for this moment. A real order would come through official channels. A real order would come from his commanding officer. Until then, the war continued. And so, while the world entered peace, Hiroo Onoda entered something else entirely. A war without an end date. A mission without reinforcement. A duty that would outlive empires. This was not madness. This was obedience, taken to its absolute conclusion. When the fighting on Lubang Island collapsed in early 1945, it did not end suddenly or cleanly. It dissolved. Japanese positions were overrun. Officers vanished. Orders stopped coming. What remained was confusion, fear, and fragments of men trained for a war that no longer had shape or direction. Hiroo Onoda retreated into the interior of the island with 3 other soldiers, Yuichi Akatsu, Shoichi Shimada, and Kenshichi Kazuka. They were not fleeing in panic. They were executing doctrine. The jungle was not a place of defeat. It was a place of continuation. From the moment they disappeared beneath the canopy, the outside world ceased to exist. The jungle of Lubang Island was dense, humid, and unforgiving. Visibility was limited to a few meters. Rain fell suddenly and without warning. Clothing rotted. Metal rusted. Insects never stopped biting. Every movement required effort, and every mistake carried consequences. Yet this environment was exactly what Onoda had been trained for. They built hidden shelters from branches and leaves, careful to erase signs of their presence. Fires were small and controlled. Smoke was avoided. Food was scavenged cautiously. Bananas, coconuts, wild plants, and occasionally stolen rice from nearby farms. Ammunition was counted obsessively. Rifles were cleaned daily, regardless of weather or exhaustion. Time lost meaning. Days were measured not by calendars but by patrols, weather, and hunger. Onoda insisted on discipline. Uniforms were maintained as best as possible. Weapons inspections continued. Sentinels were posted. Orders were followed. This was not survival. This was war as they understood it. In August 1945, leaflets began to fall from the sky. They drifted slowly through the trees, landing on the jungle floor like harmless scraps of paper. The messages were clear and written in Japanese. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Soldiers were urged to lay down their arms and return home. Onoda read them carefully. Then he dismissed them. Psychological warfare had been part of his training. The enemy would use deception to break resistance. False surrender announcements were expected. Fake newspapers could be printed. Voices on loudspeakers could be recorded. Even Japanese prisoners could be forced to cooperate. Nothing in the leaflets came through official command channels. Nothing carried a direct order. Nothing came from Major Taniguchi. Therefore, nothing was real. The group discussed the messages, but Onoda's conclusion was firm. The war was ongoing. The leaflets were bait. As weeks passed, the leaflets increased. Some contained accurate details about Japanese units elsewhere. Others mentioned family members by name. One even included a photograph. To Onoda, this made them more suspicious, not less. The enemy, he believed, had done its homework. Occasionally, loudspeakers broadcast messages from the edges of the jungle. Voices urged them to surrender, promising fair treatment. Onoda interpreted this as confirmation that their resistance mattered. If the enemy was speaking to them, it meant they were still a threat. The four men continued their patrols. But time began to erode what discipline could not protect. Food grew scarcer. Clothing deteriorated. Disease weakened them. Villagers, long after the war had ended, still suffered raids on their crops and livestock. From the villagers' perspective, the attackers were criminals or ghosts, remnants of a war that refused to die. From Onoda's perspective, the villagers were enemy collaborators. Skirmishes occurred, shots were fired, blood was spilled years after peace had supposedly arrived. In 1949, Yuichi Akatsu began to change. He argued more frequently. He questioned Onoda's certainty. The leaflets troubled him. The idea that the war might truly be over began to take root. Akatsu eventually left the group, disappearing into the jungle alone. Onoda assumed he had been captured or killed. Months later, leaflets appeared again, this time containing messages written by Akatsu himself, urging the others to surrender. He claimed he had returned safely to Japan. Onoda was unmoved. If Akatsu had been captured, he could have been forced to write anything. His words proved nothing. The jungle had taught Onoda that weakness was contagious. Doubt, once allowed, spread quickly. The remaining 3 soldiers closed ranks. Years passed. In 1954, Shoichi Shimada was killed during a confrontation with a local patrol. He died not knowing the war had ended 9 years earlier. His body was left behind, claimed by the jungle. Onoda and Kazuka buried him quickly and moved on. There was no ceremony, no time for grief. War did not pause for loss. By now, Japan had rebuilt itself into a peaceful nation. Children were growing up without memories of bombings or air raids. New laws had been written. A new constitution existed. On Lubang Island, none of that mattered. Onoda and Kazuka continued their routine: patrol, observe, sabotage when necessary, and disappear. They burned crops they believed were meant for enemy use. They avoided capture at all costs. Every encounter reinforced their belief that the war was still active. In their minds, survival itself was proof of correctness. If the war were truly over, why were they being hunted? If Japan had truly surrendered, why did armed men still pursue them? Logic, shaped entirely by wartime doctrine, reinforced itself. By the late 1960s, Hiroo Onoda had been fighting a war alone for over 20 years. His rifle still worked. His ammunition was low but carefully preserved. His uniform was tattered but worn with pride. He was no longer waiting for victory. He was waiting for orders. The jungle had not defeated him. Time had not defeated him. Hunger, isolation, and fear had not defeated him. Only one thing could end his war. And it had not arrived yet. By the mid-1950s, Hiroo Onoda's war had entered a new phase, not louder, not more dramatic, but far lonelier and far more dangerous. The jungle no longer hid a group of soldiers. It hid fragments of a war that only one man still believed in completely. After the death of Shoichi Shimada, only Onoda and Kinshichi Kazuka remained. They did not speak often about the past. Talking wasted energy. Memory for Onoda was not something to revisit, it was something to preserve exactly as it had been. The war had rules, and as long as those rules were followed, reality remained stable. Each morning began the same way. Weapons were checked, ammunition counted, clothing adjusted. Even as fabric decayed and boots fell apart, the ritual remained. Discipline was the last structure left in a world that no longer recognized their existence. They lived like shadows. Shelters were temporary. Camps were abandoned regularly. Tracks were erased. Fires were rare and small. Smoke meant detection, and detection meant death or capture, both unacceptable outcomes. They moved silently through terrain they now knew better than any map could show. Villages became both lifelines and threats. From Onoda's perspective, local farmers were not civilians. They were resources controlled by the enemy. Rice stored in huts, cattle grazing in fields, fishing equipment left unattended, all were interpreted as assets supporting hostile forces. Raids were planned carefully. Timing mattered. Speed mattered. Violence was used only when necessary, but it was not avoided when resistance appeared. Each encounter reinforced the same conclusion. The enemy was still active. Therefore, the war was still ongoing. In Japan, newspapers occasionally reported strange incidents on Lubang Island: burned crops, missing livestock, sporadic gunfire. Police patrols were sent. Warning shots were exchanged. Sometimes blood was spilled. Each clash deepened the divide between Onoda's world and the real one. When search parties approached with megaphones, calling out his name, Onoda listened carefully. He analyzed tone, phrasing, and timing. Nothing matched official protocol. Nothing came with written orders bearing military authority. It was not enough. Years passed without any sign of command. By the early 1960s, Kinshichi Kazuka had grown visibly older. His movements slowed. His patience shortened. Yet his loyalty remained intact. Together, the two men maintained the fiction that time had stopped. They marked seasons instead of years. They remembered battles instead of birthdays. In October 1972, the fragile balance shattered. Kazuka was killed during a clash with local police while attempting to burn stored rice. He died instantly, shot during an exchange that should never have existed in a world at peace. Onoda buried him quickly. There were no words spoken over the grave. Mourning was dangerous. Emotion weakened focus. What mattered was the mission. Now Hiroo Onoda was completely alone. For the first time in nearly 30 years, there was no one left to confirm his beliefs, no one to share watch duty, no one to reinforce the illusion of continuity. The jungle closed in tighter than ever. Solitude did not break him. It hardened him. Onoda became more cautious, more methodical. He reduced movement. Ammunition was conserved obsessively. His rifle, over a quarter-century old, was cleaned with almost religious care. He spoke aloud less often. Thoughts remained internal, organized, disciplined. Doubt was acknowledged only as a tactical weakness to be suppressed. Occasionally, new leaflets appeared. They spoke of a modern Japan, of economic growth, of peace treaties, of former soldiers living normal lives. Photographs showed cities rebuilt, people dressed differently, faces unfamiliar. Onoda examined them carefully. Then he rejected them. The enemy, he believed, had simply improved its deception. What Onoda could not accept, what his training would not allow, was the idea that an order could expire without being formally rescinded. His entire identity rested on the belief that duty did not dissolve with time. If the war had truly ended, someone would come. If the mission were complete, someone would say so. Until then, surrender was not an option, it was betrayal. By the early 1970s, Hiroo Onoda had spent more time at war than most soldiers spend alive. His body aged, but his role did not. The jungle no longer felt hostile. It felt permanent. He had outlasted commanders, outlasted governments, outlasted the very war that had created him. Unbeknownst to him, he had become a legend in Japan, a rumor, a curiosity, a relic of an era many preferred to forget. Some believed he was dead, others believed he was insane. But Onoda was neither. He was exactly what he had been trained to be, a soldier who followed orders without exception. And somewhere beyond the trees, the world was about to collide with the last man still fighting World War II. By the time Hiroo Onoda became completely alone in the jungle, the war that had shaped his existence had faded into abstraction for the rest of the world. World War II was no longer a lived memory. It was history, contained in textbooks, documentaries, and ceremonies held once a year. In Japan, cities that had once been reduced to ashes now stood rebuilt. Neon lights replaced searchlights. Factories replaced ruins. A new constitution defined a nation that officially renounced war itself. Children grew up without air raid drills, without ration books, without the fear that had once defined daily life. The soldier on Lubang Island did not know any of this. To him, Japan was frozen in time, an empire temporarily silent, not defeated. Peace, as the world understood it, was irrelevant without orders. As years passed, reports of violence on Lubang Island became less frequent but more unsettling. Crops were burned. Gunfire echoed from the jungle. Occasionally, bodies were found. Authorities knew these acts were not criminal in the ordinary sense. They were remnants of a war that refused to end cleanly. Search efforts continued intermittently. Philippine police and Japanese officials attempted communication through leaflets, letters, and broadcasts. Family members recorded messages, pleading for surrender. Onoda read them all with careful skepticism. Emotion, he believed, was an enemy weapon. Familiar voices could be imitated. Photographs could be staged. None of it met the standard required to override a direct military order. From the perspective of the modern world, Onoda's refusal appeared irrational. From his perspective, surrender without command would have been the first truly irrational act of his life. As decades passed, the world stopped trying as hard. Search missions became symbolic rather than urgent. News articles framed Onoda as a curiosity, the last Japanese holdout, a man out of time. His story was discussed in terms of psychology, not duty. He was increasingly portrayed as a tragic figure rather than an active soldier. Onoda never saw these descriptions. In the jungle, his life continued according to wartime rhythm. Days were spent observing. Nights were spent listening. Rain fell. Dry seasons passed. His hair turned gray. His eyesight weakened. Yet his routine never changed. The jungle aged with him. Trees grew where old paths once existed. Landmarks shifted. What had once been a battlefield transformed into farmland and villages. Occasionally, helicopters passed overhead, machines far more advanced than anything Onoda remembered. He watched them silently. To him, they were simply newer weapons. Meanwhile, Japan's relationship with its wartime past grew complicated. The nation wanted peace, prosperity, and distance from the ideology that had led it into catastrophe. Stories like Onoda's were uncomfortable reminders of absolute loyalty taken to its extreme. Some admired his dedication, others feared what it represented. In 1970, when Kinshichi Kazuka was killed, international news briefly reignited interest in the mysterious soldier still at large. But even then, the world treated the event as an anomaly, an echo fading rather than a warning continuing. Onoda did not know Kazuka's death had been reported globally. He only knew he was alone. Isolation sharpened his awareness. He reduced contact with villages. He avoided confrontation whenever possible. Survival was now less about engagement and more about endurance. His war had narrowed to its purest form: remain hidden, remain armed, remain obedient. The jungle became not just shelter but proof. If the world truly had forgotten him, it had not forgotten the need to search. Patrols still appeared occasionally. Helicopters still circled. Why, then, would a victorious enemy continue to hunt a single man? This question reinforced his certainty. In Japan, however, belief in Onoda's survival was slowly turning into doubt. Many assumed he had finally died. Others thought he might never have existed at all, that the story had grown beyond its facts. The man himself remained unchanged. He lived without clocks, without mirrors, without confirmation of age. He no longer counted years. Counting years implied waiting for something. He waited for nothing except orders. His identity had been stripped to its core. He was not a civilian. He was not a survivor. He was not a relic. He was a soldier on active duty. Unaware that he had become a symbol, Hiroo Onoda continued his patrols beneath a canopy of trees that had grown older with him. The world beyond the jungle had moved forward, away from war, away from empire, away from the kind of obedience that had shaped him. But the past had not released him. And somewhere far away, a young man who had grown up in a peaceful Japan was about to go looking for a ghost. By the early 1970s, Hiroo Onoda existed more as rumor than as man. In Japan, his name surfaced occasionally in newspapers, usually accompanied by disbelief or cautious fascination. The idea that a soldier could still be fighting decades after the war had ended seemed impossible to a generation raised in peace. For many, the story belonged somewhere between legend and embarrassment. One person took it seriously. Norio Suzuki was not a soldier, a journalist, or an official representative of the state. He was a young Japanese traveler, recently graduated, disillusioned with conventional life, and determined to experience the world on his own terms. Unlike the government or the media, Suzuki did not approach Onoda as a problem to be solved. He approached him as a man who might still be alive. Suzuki announced openly that he intended to find three things in his travels: the last Japanese soldier, a panda, and the abominable snowman. He said this half-jokingly, but his intent was genuine. Where others saw myth, Suzuki saw unfinished business. In 1974, Suzuki traveled to the Philippines and made his way to Lubang Island. He carried no weapon. He wore no uniform. He brought no official documents. What he carried instead was a willingness to speak plainly. Onoda observed Suzuki long before revealing himself. The stranger moved differently from soldiers or police. He did not patrol. He did not search. He walked openly, called out in Japanese, and made no attempt to hide. This alone was unusual enough to demand attention. When Onoda finally stepped out of the jungle, rifle in hand, Suzuki did not run. He bowed. The gesture mattered. For Onoda, this was the first real anomaly in nearly 30 years. Suzuki did not speak like an enemy. He did not issue demands. He did not urge immediate surrender. He simply introduced himself and stated that he had come to meet Lieutenant Onoda. They spoke at length. Suzuki explained that the war had ended long ago. He described a Japan transformed beyond recognition, peaceful, prosperous, no longer governed by military command. He spoke of families waiting, of soldiers who had returned home, of a nation that no longer fought. Onoda listened carefully. Then he replied with calm certainty. He would not surrender. He would not lay down his arms. He would not accept information without orders. He explained the conditions clearly. If Major Taniguchi, his former commanding officer, were to personally relieve him of duty, he would obey. Until then, the mission remained active. Suzuki did not argue. This was perhaps his greatest success. Unlike previous attempts, Suzuki did not dismiss Onoda's logic or attempt to break it. He understood that Onoda was not confused. He was consistent. His entire identity rested on a single rule. Orders came from command, not circumstance. Suzuki promised to return. He left Lubang Island carrying proof that stunned Japan. Hiroo Onoda was alive. The revelation shocked the nation. The story that had once been a curiosity became a headline. Government officials, historians, and the public were forced to confront a living artifact of an era they believed long buried. After considerable effort, the Japanese government located Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. He was no longer an officer. He was no longer powerful. He worked in a civilian bookstore. The empire he had served no longer existed. But authority, in Onoda's world, did not expire. Taniguchi agreed to travel to Lubang Island. Back in the jungle, Onoda waited. He continued his routines. He maintained his weapon. He observed the terrain. Suzuki's visit had not shaken him. It had simply introduced a conditional possibility, the first one in decades. For the first time since 1944, the end of the war had a specific shape. It would arrive in the form of an order. And this time, the world intended to deliver it. In February 1974, the jungle of Lubang Island prepared to witness something it had never seen before. The end of a war that had lasted nearly 30 years for one man. Hiroo Onoda waited. Waiting had never been difficult for him. His entire adult life had been shaped around endurance. Yet this waiting felt different. For the first time, the possibility of release existed, not through surrender, not through death, but through obedience fulfilled. He maintained his routine. Each morning he checked his rifle. The weapon was old but functional. The bolt still slid smoothly. The ammunition, carefully preserved for decades, remained deadly. His uniform, faded and patched countless times, was cleaned as thoroughly as the jungle allowed. Appearance mattered. A soldier did not meet his commanding officer as a ghost. When Norio Suzuki returned to the island, he did not come alone. With him was Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. Taniguchi looked nothing like the officer Onoda remembered. He was older, thinner, dressed in civilian clothing. Time had passed over him heavily, but when he spoke, his voice carried the same authority it had nearly 30 years earlier. Onoda stepped out of the jungle and stood at attention. The posture was instinctive, automatic. His body remembered what his world had never allowed him to forget. Taniguchi read from a prepared statement. The words were formal, precise, and unmistakable. All combat activities are to cease immediately. The Imperial Japanese Army has been dissolved. You are hereby relieved of all military duties. For a moment, Onoda did not move. He listened. He listened not for comfort, not for explanation, but for legitimacy. The order came directly from his commanding officer. It followed military protocol. It contained no ambiguity. The war, as defined by his world, was over. Onoda removed his cap and bowed deeply. 30 years of resistance ended not with surrender, but with compliance. He handed over his rifle. It was still loaded. He surrendered ammunition, grenades, and a sword he had carried since 1944. Everything was intact. Everything had been maintained. Nothing had been abandoned. As he stepped forward, leaving the jungle behind, Onoda crossed a boundary far more profound than geography. He crossed from one era into another, from a world governed by absolute orders into one ruled by uncertainty. The moment was quiet. There was no celebration, no triumph, no shame. Only exhaustion. Onoda was taken to a nearby town. Medical staff examined him. They found a man physically weakened but mentally precise. His posture remained rigid, his speech formal. He spoke as if reporting for duty, not returning from a personal odyssey. The Philippine government faced a dilemma. Onoda had killed civilians and police officers in the decades following the war. By law, he could be prosecuted. By history, he was something else entirely. A relic of obedience. President Ferdinand Marcos granted him a full pardon, recognizing that Onoda had believed, without doubt, that he was still at war. When Onoda returned to Japan, he did not find the country he had left. There were no ruins, no ration lines, no military parades. The streets were filled with unfamiliar sounds, unfamiliar clothes, unfamiliar faces. Japan had become something else, peaceful, prosperous, and unrecognizable. Crowds gathered to see him. Cameras flashed. Reporters asked questions he struggled to understand. Was he angry? Did he regret anything? Did he feel betrayed? Onoda answered carefully. He had followed orders. Nothing more, nothing less. The simplicity of that truth made many uncomfortable. Because it forced a question no one wanted to ask. If obedience could last this long, what did it say about the system that created it? Hiroo Onoda had not been broken by war. He had been preserved by it. And now, with the final order delivered, the last Japanese soldier of World War II stepped fully into a peace he had never trained for. Hiroo Onoda returned to Japan in 1974, a man who had lived through a war the world had long declared over. Cities he remembered as rubble had become bustling metropolises. Streets, neon lights, and modern life surrounded him. Yet for Onoda, this world was unfamiliar. The jungle had been his universe, ruled by discipline, survival, and obedience. He had followed orders perfectly. That was all. Victory, survival, or glory were never the point. Obedience had been his mission. Now, with the final command given, the war had truly ended. The world called him a hero, a relic, even a cautionary tale. For Onoda, he was simply a soldier who had done his duty. He traveled, shared his story, and reflected on the cost of absolute loyalty, teaching that discipline without judgment could isolate and endanger, but also sustain extraordinary endurance. World War II ended in 1945, but for Hiroo Onoda, it ended only when the order finally arrived. 30 years of war, obedience, and survival came to peace not by choice, but by command. He walked out of the jungle, rifle surrendered, a man who had proven the power and the weight of unwavering duty. If you want to uncover more untold stories from history, don't forget to subscribe and join the journey.